You want me to check it while you're not here?
No. It took 3 months and over 300 combined hours to get to this moment, when we fit 2 faces of our Montessori play cube together for the first time. In truth, it shouldn't have taken us nearly this long, but as beginner woodworkers in a shop not yet dialed in for precision projects, my dad and I encountered a lot of obstacles. But we persevered, and this build quickly came to mean more than I could have ever imagined. Here's how it started. A few months ago, my sister showed me a picture of a $300 Montessori play cube and asked if I could build one for my niece. I quickly said yes, and my dad and I sat down in my newly built home office to design the project. There's a tradition in my family of grandfathers building toys for their grandkids, and even though I'm not a grandfather, I'm excited to be part of continuing that tradition. For the Montessori cube, the design needed to be versatile and fun, but we were also really concerned about making it safe, so we decided to start with a smaller practice build of the cube first to test our techniques and identify any unforeseen challenges before moving on to the full-scale project. And after cutting everything out and doing a dry fit, it was actually looking pretty promising.
The cube! The cube!
It wasn't until we started trying to square everything up that we noticed just how tricky it is to line up 45s. We got pretty close, but those precision issues started to really show, and we realized that pretty close just wasn't going to cut it, so we needed a new plan. That's when we started to wonder, WWGD, what would Grandpa do? And we landed on box joints. Here's the plan. We'll create 6 20 by 20 inch panels, including 4 side panels with box cut joinery, and a top and bottom panel with rabbet cuts. Each face will feature a different cutout design, and we'll attach everything together in the end with wood glue. Box joinery was a signature in Grandpa's shop, and while he would have just used a dado stack to cut these, I just wasn't comfortable enough yet to use one. So we started looking for a no-dado box joint jig build and landed on some plans by Steve Maskery. I have a separate video all about this build that you should definitely check out, but for now, I'll give you a quick overview of how the jig works. The jig consists of 5 different parts: the base plate, the backboard, 2 bumper plates, and a shuttle. The project piece sits against the shuttle, which you slide back and forth to create the box joint notch using the table saw. With the jig up and running, we were ready to grab our project panels and cut them down to size. These panels were already 20 inches wide, so we just cut them to 20 inches long as well to make a nice square. We settled on 20 inches since it'll be a good size for my niece now, but also big enough that she'll be able to grow into it. Once we had all 4 sides of the cube cut, we stacked them together to make sure they were as close to identical in size as we could get them, and then labeled them for how they would fit together. I made a simple box joint template that we used to rough in where the cuts would be placed. We didn't use this as a cutting template, it was just to help us keep track of all of the different edges and plan around various knots and imperfections in the wood. Once we had everything marked and ready, it was time for a test cut on the new jig.
This is the test cut.
Here comes the test, everybody! The first cut!
Woohoo!
See how it looks. Ooh!
With a promising test cut under our belt, we got to work cutting the box joints on all 4 of the side panels for the cube. Each panel needed joints across 2 sides, and of course they had to fit together in the end, so there was a lot of flip-flopping and double-checking our markings before we started each panel. And then it was time to put it all together for the first time.
You want me to check it while you're not here?
No.
It works!
While we were obviously stoked with these results, we did notice we had some kind of accumulating error occurring in the cuts as they got gradually sloppier and sloppier the more you did. This is likely due to another precision issue we're going to have to resolve, but because it was pretty minor and we wanted to make sure the panels would fit together in the end, we decided to keep on going and focus on shimming any gaps once all of the pieces were finished. We turned our attention back to the boards and finished cutting out all of the box joint notches. In the end, we cut 48 notches across the 4 panels, which was a lot of work, but the results speak for themselves.
It went! Ah! Boom, 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 bang! High five! Woohoo!
Finally, we were seeing some real progress, and I was actually able to picture my niece playing with it. With the side panels all cut, it was on to the fun part, marking up and cutting out the designs. We started with the circle panel. I began by marking out center and then used Grandpa's old compass to mark the circle itself, which we quickly realized was too small, so I came back and made it a little bit bigger. Then we added a pilot hole we could start the jigsaw from and clamped everything for the cut. We attached our circular jigsaw jig at the center pivot point of the board and made our cut. If you're not familiar with Montessori toys, the whole idea is that there's no right way to interact with them. It's all about encouraging kids to be imaginative in their play, so we're leaving these designs up to my niece's interpretation. We realized I must not have been holding the saw quite straight as the whole cut was tapered inwards a bit, and we also had a pesky little notch to fill from the pilot hole.
The hole isn't quite perfect, and we want to trim it up, but we don't trust ourselves to trim it up freehand with a router.
Yep.
And since we no longer have a center pivot, we can't use the jigsaw.
The jigsaw.
But we happen to find a circle that is exactly the right size.
Yes, look. Sawdust and all.
Funny as this may look, it worked damn well as a template to clean up the circle. We just clamped the panel onto the shop vac and threw a flush trim bit onto the router, and away we went. As for that notch, we used a really neat little trick to fill it in quickly. We put a dab of CA glue on the notch and then dusted it with baking soda, which hardens the glue almost instantly and makes it super solid. Moving on, the other faces didn't give us quite so much trouble. We turned our attention to the triangle face next, which I marked up and we again added pilot holes to. I used the jig again to round out the corners, and then set up a makeshift fence for the straight cuts, and everything was looking good. Third on our list was this grid of mini circles. We played around with the sizing of these a bit because we wanted to make sure there was enough material between each circle that it would hold her weight if she climbed around on them. We landed on 3-inch circles, which we cut using a hole saw on the drill press. And the only annoying part of this was that the core of the cut kept getting stuck in the hole saw, so we just used a couple of screws to wiggle it out and kept pushing on to the final face. The last panel was made up of 3 slots. Again, we thought about using 4 slots here, but wanted to make sure there was enough material left over to keep it nice and sturdy. There's no real telling how my niece will choose to play with this, so we wanted to have all of our bases covered. With all of the faces cut, it was time to whip out the router and round off the edges. When you're making something for little ones, it's important to make sure there aren't any sharp corners or edges that they're going to hurt themselves on. So we were very careful about softening and sanding everything really well. It's also much easier to sand down these pieces individually before we assembled everything together. Speaking of assembly, that was the next step. We glued our 4 side panels together and let it set up overnight before coming back to address the gapping issues we had noticed earlier. There actually weren't a lot of spaces to shim, but we used a few layers of veneer to fill the more obvious gaps. Once they were dry, we cut down the excess and moved on to dressing the top. Two of our side panels were out just a hair from each other, so we used the flush trim bit on the router to even everything out. Next, we cut our top and bottom faces of the cube. I cut rabbets all the way around each panel, doing a first pass to clear out the bulk of the material and a second pass to clean everything up. Then we glued everything together and let it set overnight. I overcut some of the rabbets the day before, so we cut a few 45-degree strips to hide the gaps and keep little fingers from getting pinched. The last step was to round off the cube edges and do a final pass with the sander before the big reveal. When I started this project, I set out to build a box for a toddler, but it's clear to me now that this build is so much more than just that. It's a rocket ship, it's a kitchen, it's a race car. It's not just a toy box, it's a box of imagination just waiting to be opened.